He set the little clock face down on the shelf before he'd even finished shaking her hand. That's the detail I keep coming back to. A man doesn't hide the time from a stranger, unless the time means something he isn't ready to explain. My name's not important for this story. Call me the narrator if you like, because that's really all I am here. A voice carrying you into a house on the edge of the Dakota grassland in the last cold months of 1887, where a sheriff named Silas Radnor stood on an empty train platform waiting for a woman he had never met to step off a train, and without either of them quite agreeing to it, rearrange the rest of his life. Silas was 36 that November. He'd worn the badge in the town of Widow's Bend for 6 years, and in that time he had learned to say almost nothing and mean almost all of it. His deputy ran the office when he wasn't there. His horse ran the ranch when he wasn't there either, or near enough. Silas handled the parts of a day that needed a human hand on them, and let the rest take care of itself, the way a man learns to when there's no one at home to ask him how his day went. 3 weeks before that Thursday, he'd placed 9 lines in the county paper. Housekeeper wanted. Cook clean, room and board through the winter. No references required. He'd written it himself, standing at the counter of the print shop. And he'd deliberately left off the word sheriff's residence, because he didn't want whoever answered to decide anything about him before she'd even seen his face. One letter came back. It was written in a careful, rounded hand, with several words crossed out and rewritten, not from carelessness, he thought, but from a woman determined to get the English exactly right. She was from Prague, she wrote. She'd landed in Chicago 10 months earlier and had kept house for 2 families since. She could cook, clean, tend children, nurse the sick. She would ask for nothing but a room, and whatever board was ordinary. She was not afraid of a hard winter. He read that letter 3 times across 2 days before he wrote back with a date. Now here he was, hat pulled low against a wind that came off the flats in long, cold sheets, watching the 240 pull into Widow's Bend a full 10 minutes behind its own name. Steam rolled sideways along the platform and broke apart against the depot wall. 3 men climbed down, then a woman with a child. Then nothing for long enough that he wondered if she'd changed her mind somewhere between Chicago and here. Then she stepped down. She carried 1 bag, a small brown leather thing held with both hands in front of her like it might be taken from her if she let it swing. She stood at the platform's edge and looked at the town, 1 gray street, a church spire, a water tower with an expression that wasn't disappointment and wasn't relief either. It was the look of someone doing arithmetic, weighing what stood in front of her against what she'd left behind. Her hair was light brown, pinned under a gray wool hat. Her coat was clean, decently kept, but thin for a Dakota November. She hadn't looked at him yet. He walked toward her anyway. He said the name from her letter, America, and it came out more question than greeting. She turned. Her eyes found the badge on his coat first, then his face. Neither of them smiled. "Yes," she said. "That is me." Her accent was there, but not heavy, the kind that had already survived some distance, some number of strangers making her repeat herself. He said he was glad the train had made up the time it lost. She said it had left the last station 40 minutes late and closed most of that gap somewhere along the way. That was the whole of their introduction, weather and a train schedule, nothing more, and somehow it was enough for both of them to start walking. He reached for her bag. She let him take it without a fight, and that told him something already. A woman who insists on carrying her own luggage is usually still performing that she doesn't need anyone. America had put that performance down somewhere on the road from Prague, and she didn't pick it back up for him. If you've ever moved somewhere you didn't know a single soul, you understand what she was doing in that first quarter mile. She was reading the town the way you read a face, quickly, for anything that might turn dangerous or kind. I want you to hold that feeling while we walk with her, because a lot of this story is about a woman learning a place 1 careful observation at a time, and a man learning much more slowly how to let himself be observed. The street was mud gone hard at the edges, soft in the wagon ruts where the sun had touched it. He led her down the left side toward the last house on the row, set slightly crooked to the road as though it had been built in a hurry and never straightened out. 2 stories. A porch running the whole front of it. A woodpile stacked against the near wall, taller than the first window. She looked at that woodpile the way some women look at a well-tended garden. He told her the house had 2 bedrooms upstairs and a small room off the kitchen that used to hold nothing but crates and was cleared now, with a good stove set into the wall. She could have either, he said, whichever suited her. Which is warmer, she asked. The one off the kitchen. By a fair distance. That one, then? He opened the door and stood back to let her go in first. The front room held a table, 4 chairs, a stone hearth laid but not lit, and a shelf of small objects he clearly hadn't looked at in years. A tin candle holder, a folded square of cloth. A little clock stopped dead. The kitchen sat through the far doorway, and she went to it without waiting to be shown, stood in the middle of the room, took it all in, stove, window, shelves. A single coat hook, and set both hands flat on the edge of the work table, still for a moment, like a swimmer testing water before committing to it. He left her bag by the small room's door and came back to find her watching him with that same platform expression. Calculating, deciding. "Where do you keep the flour?" she asked. He told her. She found it on the second shelf, behind a tin of salt and a jar of something gone dark and past identifying, which she didn't comment on. She hauled the flour forward, checked the weight of it with one hand, set it down. He stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms, not in her way, but not gone either, and watched her open the stove and survey the mess of old ash inside it. She found the ash pan under the stove without being told where to look. Her movements weren't fast, exactly. They were economical, the kind of motion that comes from a person who has never once wasted an effort she didn't have to spend. She had never stood in this kitchen before in her life, and within 4 minutes it made complete sense to her. He crossed to the wood box and loaded the stove himself, without asking whether she wanted the help. She stepped back to give him room, then forward again the second he'd finished, lighting it herself with the long matches from the tin she had already noticed sitting at the back of the shelf. The kitchen began to warm. She opened the lower cabinet, potatoes, a couple of onions, dried beans, a side of salt pork wrapped in paper, and stood cataloging it the way you'd read a short letter. He told her there was more at the general store that he hadn't known exactly what she'd need. "This will do for tonight," she said, and that ended that. He went and lit the fire laid in the front room hearth. She heard it catch through the open doorway. He came back and took up his post near the kitchen door frame again, and she began to understand this was where he stood in his own kitchen, not at the table like he owned the room outright. Near the edge of it, present but not demanding anything of the space. She put water on. She started the salt pork. At some point her eyes went to that stopped clock through the doorway, 3:20 forever, and she didn't ask about it. Not her business, but she noticed. If you've ever walked into a house and clocked the one thing nobody talks about, you know the particular weight of noticing something and choosing to say nothing. He set the table while she cooked, 2 plates, 2 cups. Done so plainly it was clear he'd set a table 10,000 times and expected no credit for it. They sat across from each other and ate while the fire popped and the wind hit the window once and then went quiet. Outside, full dark had come down. Inside, the low light and the stove heat made the little house feel less hollow than it had looked from the road. When she finished, he cleared the plates himself and washed them himself. She moved to help. He shook his head once, not unkindly, just letting her know he had it, so she stood by the door and let him. When he dried his hands, he crossed to that small stopped clock on the shelf. He didn't wind it. He didn't touch the hands. He just laid it face down, carefully, like a task he'd meant to finish for a long while and had only now gotten around to. She didn't ask about that either. He showed her the spare room, narrow bed, a chest at its foot, a bare nail on the wall, floor recently swept, the marks of the broom still visible if you knew to look. Someone had known she was coming and had done that much for her. He told her about the extra blanket in the chest, the well around the east side, the outhouse, practical things, said in short sentences that didn't leave room for questions. She nodded. He left her to it. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house tick and settle around her, and to him moving in the other room, and then to nothing for a long while. Wind picked up again outside. Past the east window there was no light anywhere, just the flat black of open country in winter. She took off her boots and lined them by the door. The blanket in the chest was heavy wool, faintly cedar. She laid it over the bed without fully unfolding it and lay down on the coverlet in her coat, because she wasn't ready to be entirely undone yet, not on a first night in a stranger's house. She'd arrived at the end of a very long day with almost nothing to her name, and had eaten a hot supper in a warm room and been given a bed with a cedar-smelling blanket and a nail on the wall that asked nothing of her. She didn't make anything grand of that. She just filed it the way you file a change in temperature quietly and for later. At some point she slept, because she woke to a different kind of dark, a settled one, and through the thin wall she could hear the slow breathing of a house that had been still for hours. It had snowed. When she rose to the window, the world outside had been entirely remade overnight, the street below smooth and untracked, storefront signs half hidden behind frost on the glass. She pressed one finger to the pane and felt the cold move straight through it. She didn't linger there. She refolded the blanket along its own crease, laid it at the foot of the bed close to how she'd found it, and tied her boots with the same careful double knot she'd used since she was 7 years old, sitting on a cold floor in a country she didn't live in anymore, her mother's hands over hers. She didn't dwell on that either. Downstairs the stove had gone low overnight, but not cold, coals still glowing orange under gray ash. She fed it kindling, the way she'd been feeding stoves since before she could read, and by the time the kettle was filled and set to heat, the room had already begun losing its night chill. She had to open 3 cupboards before she found the coffee, a tin half full, sitting beside a jar of dried beans and a sack of flour rolled down and pinned shut. She measured by eye because eye was the only measure she had, and she was setting 2 cups on the counter when she heard him on the stairs. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn right away, she let him take it in first. The fire, the kettle, the smell of coffee nearly ready. She heard, without needing to see it, the specific stillness of a man who has walked into something other than what he expected. Then she turned. He was dressed, shirt tucked, suspenders up, hair combed but not quite settled. He looked at the 2 cups, he looked at her. She said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. She'd set 2 cups because 2 people lived in this house. It wasn't a gesture. It was arithmetic, same as everything else she did that morning. He took the chair across from her and set both hands flat on the wood. Outside, a horse passed slow through the snow, its hoofbeats barely a sound at all. She poured his coffee, set it down, and took her own to the far end of the counter, not the table, not yet. There was a distance that still made sense between 2 strangers, and she was keeping it, and he wasn't asking her to close it. They drank without talking, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It'd wait, but the wait sat right. She watched the snow. He watched the table or something past it she couldn't locate. When he finished, he rinsed his own cup at the basin, which she hadn't expected, and set it upside down on the cloth she'd laid out for exactly that purpose. As though he'd always known the cloth would be there. Then he put on his coat, took his hat from the peg, and went out into the snow without a word of ceremony. Now, here's the thing about a story like this one. It isn't built out of one big moment. It's built out of 100 small ones, cups and clocks and woodpiles. And if you stay with me, you're going to watch 2 people who barely speak learn each other entirely through the small stuff. Until one ordinary evening, the small stuff stops being small at all. But that's still a long way off. Right now, all America had was a house to learn. She spent her first 3 days simply locating things. The spare blankets on the high shelf, the jar of bacon grease behind the flour, the drawer that stuck and needed lifting before it would pull open. By the end of the first week, she'd started to understand the rhythm of the man who lived there rather than just the shape of his rooms. He was gone before first light most mornings. He came back for 20 minutes around mid-afternoon, long enough to eat something standing at the counter if she'd left food out, and then he was gone again until supper. He ate everything she made and never once commented on it, and he never left food on the plate. She learned he kept a small ledger and set it on the side table every evening as though it had never occurred to him that anyone might read it. She never did. She dusted around it, same as she dusted around everything that wasn't hers to touch. She learned he slept lightly. Twice she'd woken before dawn to the soft drag of a boot heel, the back door easing on its hinge like he'd oiled it specifically to be quiet. The third time she heard it, she lay still and thought about what kind of sleep produces that kind of care, the kind a person learns fast, out of necessity. Or the kind that had simply never been any different. She recognized it because she'd carried that same kind of sleep herself, once, before she taught herself to let the night run long again. By the second week, the snow had stopped being an event and become a condition, one fall arriving before the last had finished settling. She kept the stove through the night, and the house held its warmth better than she'd expected. Somebody had built it well, though she never asked who. There was a window at the east end of the kitchen that caught exactly 20 minutes of morning light before the angle shifted past it, and without ever deciding to, she started planning her mornings around that light. One morning, he brought in a second axe handle and set it on the table without a word. The first had cracked 2 days earlier. She'd watched him look at it the way a man looks at something he expected to outlast him, and then simply set it against the wall. She didn't ask where the new one had come from. What she noticed was that he'd carried it into the house instead of leaving it in the barn. Small things like that were starting to add up in her ledger, the one nobody kept but her. She'd begun reading that house the way she used to read other people's houses back in her first months in this country. The grammar of where things were kept, what stayed close at hand, what got stored high and out of the way. Lamp oil by the back door, 2 blankets on the top shelf, never one. A rifle that hung on the wall and was cleaned on a schedule she couldn't work out because the schedule lived entirely in his head. She cooked with whatever the pantry gave her, some days generous, some days thin, and she never complained and he never remarked, except that when a meal came out right, not fancy, just exactly seasoned, he'd finish it before he looked up, and the looking up was the whole of his compliment. She understood that quickly and stopped waiting for anything more. The child from 2 doors down showed up at the kitchen window on a Thursday afternoon, just a small face and 2 mittened hands pressed flat to the glass. She was maybe 6 years old, with her mother's suspicious eyes and an entirely separate boldness of her own. She'd appeared at that window twice before and always vanished before the door could open. This time she stayed. Marika opened the door. "Do you want to come in out of the cold?" The girl studied her. "Are you the sheriff's wife?" "No." The girl weighed that answer with real seriousness, the way you'd file information for later, and then came in anyway, sat at the table. Ate a biscuit in 4 precise bites, asked nothing further, and eventually slid off the chair and went back out into the snow without a word of explanation. Marika stood in the open door and watched her go. That evening he noticed the second cup still on the table. He looked at it, then at her. "A child from down the road," she said. "Cora's girl," he said. "Nettie." And that was all, except he picked the cup up himself and set it in the basin, which was such a small motion she almost let it pass without registering it. She registered it. Nettie came back the next morning, no knock, appearing in the doorway the instant the latch turned, as though she'd been standing at some precise, measured distance waiting for the sound. She had a black 4-hole button in her fist and held it out with the gravity of a business transaction. Marika took it, asked nothing about where it had come from, went to the mending basket, found a near match, and sat the girl down with bread and butter while she worked. Nettie watched her hands with the focused attention of somebody learning a skill she fully intended to use later in life. Neither of them spoke. When the button was replaced, Nettie held it to the window light, examined it, gave one satisfied nod, and left the way she'd come without ceremony. Silas came home to find Marika still at the table, the mending basket open, her hands finally still. She'd been sitting there longer than she realized. He looked at the basket. He looked at her hands. He didn't ask anything. He washed the day off at the basin, and that was the whole exchange. And yet that evening he built the fire up higher than usual without explaining why. It had turned sharply colder in the afternoon, the kind of cold that promises worse coming. She saw him glance once toward the road, and she understood exactly what he was thinking, because she'd been thinking the same thing about a small girl walking home in that wind. Neither of them said it out loud. They didn't need to. If you've ever lived with someone through a long silence and realized you were both worrying about the exact same thing without a single word passing between you, you already know what was starting to happen in that house, even if the 2 people inside it weren't ready to call it by name yet. They sat through that evening the usual way, her with the mending, him with paperwork spread at the far end of the table. Working in a quiet she'd grown careful about, the specific weight of his attention filling a room without him ever asking for it to. She'd been in that house almost 6 weeks by then. She knew how he took his coffee. She knew the particular tightness in his jaw when something at the office hadn't gone clean, and how he refused to bring that tightness home with him. She knew he'd reread the same 3 pages of the same book without turning a fourth, because he wasn't reading at all, he was thinking. And he'd set the book down the exact moment whatever he was working through resolved itself. She had learned him the way you learn a place, not by studying it on purpose, but by moving through it long enough that it stopped surprising you. What she hadn't accounted for was the morning it stopped feeling like a place at all, and started feeling like something she didn't have a plain word for in either of her languages. She set the mending down, looked at her hands. Outside, wind pressed against the glass. She picked the mending back up, because it was the sensible thing to do. There was a collar to finish and the lamp light was still good, and she didn't look at him again, which took a specific, practiced effort she'd been quietly rehearsing for weeks without ever calling it rehearsal. He turned a page, she heard it. She'd started noticing sounds like that weeks earlier, the particular scrape of his chair when he stood, the different weight of his boots on the floor at the end of a hard day versus an easy one. She hadn't decided to learn any of it. It had simply accumulated the way frost does, not all at once, but morning by morning, until you look up one day and the whole window's gone opaque with it. She finished the collar, folded the shirt, reached for the next piece, his work trousers, torn along the seam of the right leg. She'd mended that same tier once before, weeks earlier, back when she was still learning where things lived in this house. Now she found the old line without looking and worked along it steadily. "You don't have to stay up," he said, not looking up from his papers. "I know," she said. He went back to the papers. That was all 10 words between them, and she still hadn't moved toward the stairs. There was something clarifying in that, in the honesty of her own answer before she'd even had time to think it through. "I know" meant she was there because she'd chosen to be, not because leaving hadn't crossed her mind. She kept her eyes on the seam. Outside, the wind had settled into a steady, low push against the west wall. Not a storm, just the plains reminding a house of how big the world outside it really was. She thought about what she'd told herself when she'd agreed to come here in the first place, that it was temporary, a winter position. Money saved toward something more permanent she hadn't yet let herself picture clearly. That was still true. Nothing about it had become false. What had changed was only that whenever she tried to picture the permanent thing now, the image wouldn't hold still long enough to look at properly. She tied off her thread and clipped it. Set the trousers on the folded stack. Put both hands flat on the table for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He never looked up from his work. She reached for her tea, gone cold without her noticing, and held the cup in both hands anyway, because it was warmer to hold something than to hold nothing. He was gone before she came down the next morning. The kitchen was warm already, coffee on the back burner, 2 cups on the counter, one right side up, one still turned over the way she'd left it washing up the night before. She stood looking at that arrangement for a moment. Then she turned the second cup over, poured her coffee, and stood at the window while the light came in thin and white across the floorboards. Outside, the snow had settled overnight into something flat and exact, fence posts, road, the far line of the hills, the kind of morning that asked nothing of you and offered nothing back either. He came back mid-morning with a man she didn't recognize. They talked in low voices on the porch, and after the stranger left, Silas came in stamping snow from his boots and told her there was a dispute at the Henderson place over a property line. And he'd have to ride out that afternoon and might not make it back before dark. "I understand," she said. "There's enough wood," he said. "You won't need the shed." "I know where the shed is." He didn't answer that. He took his hat from the hook, and she thought he'd simply go, and had already half turned back to the table when he stopped, one hand still on the door frame. "Henderson boy brought a side of salt pork last week," he said. "It's in the cold box if you want some, more than I'll need on my own." She looked up at that. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at some point past her left shoulder, his hand still braced on the frame, and there was a careful set to his jaw. The kind a man wears when he isn't fully sure what he's about to say, and is trying to make sure it lands right anyway. He didn't say anything else. He put his hat on and went, and she heard his boots cross the porch and then the yard toward the livery. She turned back to the table and looked at the 2 cups sitting there, hers where she'd left it, his set a little closer to the center than it strictly needed to be. She put both hands flat on the wood again. Outside, the snow held everything unnaturally still. She left the cups exactly where they sat. She didn't move his back to its old place, and she didn't pull her own any closer to it either. And she told herself it was only because she had other things to see to, and the cups didn't matter one way or the other. She spent the afternoon on the salt pork he'd left her, more than she'd have bought for herself alone, wrapped in cloth in the cold box exactly where he'd said. She worked without hurrying, while the snow outside went quiet the particular way it does when it's finished falling. And the only thing left behind is the weight of it pressing all the sound out of the world. The Henderson boy came by at midday, tracked snow clean across her floor, looked at the pork frying in the pan, and said something in English she was still catching up to. She understood the words staying in it and told him yes, and gave him a plate, and he ate standing at the counter the way he always did, a habit she'd long since stopped trying to correct. After he left, she stood at the window a moment. The yard was white and flat, and Silas's tracks from that morning still cut across it toward the livery, each print a clean, pressed shape in the snow, already half filled in at the edges. She spent the rest of the daylight mending the tier in the front room curtain that had been bothering her since the start of November. It wasn't her curtain. She fixed it anyway, sitting close to the window for the light, needle moving in small, even stitches, the kind her hands had learned before they'd finished growing into the work. When she was done, you couldn't find where the tier had ever been. She hung it back on its rod. He came in at dusk. He looked at the curtain for a long second before he said anything, and she saw exactly where his eyes went, and looked down at the scrap of thread still caught in her fingers that she'd forgotten to put away. He washed at the basin and sat down. She set his plate in front of him, then her own across from it, and sat, and for a while there was only the fire and the wind starting up again outside, and the ordinary sound of two people eating supper in a warm room. "Curtain looks good," he said. "There was thread," she said. He nodded, looked down at his plate, and something in his face shifted the way weather shifts, not all at once, but past the point where the old condition can find its way back. They finished eating. She cleared the plates the way she always did, the same small economy of motion in everything she touched, and he sat a moment longer with his hands flat on the table, the way he did at the end of a day when there was nothing left that needed doing. Outside, the wind had settled into something steady, not a storm, just the sound of a long winter walking its last mile. She was drying her hands on the cloth by the basin when he said the word he used for her, not quite her name, because there were no real names spoken between them even now. Just the particular sound a person makes when they're calling someone they've decided matters. She turned, he was still sitting, looking at his hands on the table, then he looked up. "I want you to stay," he said. She held the cloth and didn't move. "Not through spring," he said. After, the fire made a small sound. The candle on the sill had burned down to its last inch, and in that dying light the mended curtain hung straight, its stitches invisible where the tier used to be. She set the cloth on the counter. She crossed the room and sat back down across from him. Though she didn't have to, the conversation could have finished with her standing right where she was. But she sat, and he understood exactly what that meant before she said a single word. "I don't know this country," she said. "You know this house," he said. She looked at her hands, then at him. Something she'd been holding carefully for months, the way you hold something that might break if you jostle it, she finally set down. "Yes," she said. That was the whole of it. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing he wasn't sure of turns out to be solid ground under his boots after all. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything more. He just stayed at the table, and she stayed across from him, and the candle burned down to the wick and went dark, and neither one of them moved to light another. The room held its warmth anyway. In the morning, she came downstairs to 2 cups on the counter. He'd already gone out. She stood in the doorway and looked at the yard, white, ordinary, the barn door latched, the sky just starting to lift. Then she went back in, picked up one of the cups and stood at the window with it, watching the light spread slow across the ground. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore. She was simply there, in the place that had taken her in out of a frozen December, and without either of them quite meaning to let it happen. Decided to keep her, the way land sometimes keeps whatever a storm happens to carry to its door. So what would you have done if you'd stepped off that train into a town you'd never seen, carrying one bag and nothing else, and a stranger reached out to take it from you? Would you have let him? Tell me where you're watching this from tonight. And if this one got you somewhere quiet, hit like, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment. I read every one.